we as tastemakers and music fans should be finding ways to kind of like help people broaden their, again, their horizons and break them out of those kind of like cycles. Music is content, films are content, it's all content.
For anyone even remotely tapped into the online music world, my guest today needs no introduction. Anthony Fantano, host and producer of TheNeedleDrop, holds the prestige, weight, and often controversy once reserved for the likes of the NME and Rolling Stone. The New York Times called him the only music critic that matters if you're under 25, and Forbes noted the weight his opinions carry online. Our conversation touched on the role of complexity in music, the difficulties of writing about music, and much, much more. So what was it that got you to pick up a bass in the first place?
I think at the time, most of my reasoning behind it, honestly, was that there were not really like a whole lot of in the immediate sort of friend group and network of like local musicians that like I knew around my school. There weren't really, there was maybe one other guy that played bass, and there were a lot of drummers and there were a lot of guitarists, and I figure stepping into something that there wasn't a lot of sort of would give me the opportunity to sort of, play with some different bands and stuff. I mean, afterwards, I sort of like came to the disappointing realization that nobody really wanted to play the same music that I wanted to play. So it didn't really matter anyway.
Was that a lot of hardcore stuff then around you?
There was like in Connecticut, in New England in the 2000s, yeah, there was a lot of metalcore, there was a lot of new metal, um, stuff like that. That's like when bands like Hatebreed were popping off. So, there was a lot of that sort of thing and stuff adjacent to that in the local scene at the time, yeah.
Anything else apart from metal?
Ska was really huge. Like ska was really big. There was actually like even a website where there would be like a lot of local ska shows posted on a regular basis. But not that the music scene was like jumping or anything. It's like, but there's more kind of good touring artists passing through these days than there were back then. So, but we sort of like made do and stuff, and it's like a lot of VFW shows and shows that were just like kind of booked at random halls and venues, and they'd charge you like a couple bucks at the door or something, and the whole DIY thing.
Do you play any other instruments apart from bass?
Some guitar, some drums, some keys, but mostly bass.
One thing that I asked Stanley Donwood, who's Radiohead's artist, was how his level of musicianship either helped or hindered his ability to connect, in his case, paintings and music. He's quite frank in his kind of complete lack of musical understanding. I know you're a bit more of a musician than he is, but do you relate to that at all? That it stops you getting bogged down in all the details and being able to look at the music a little bit more holistically?
It doesn't really factor to, it's like while I know how to play music and I think like it gives me certainly an ear for when maybe things are uh not technically sound, in terms of like harmony or tempo or song structure or anything like that. I think it definitely gives me some I'll say like gut feelings I can work off of to kind of like tell me maybe before somebody who doesn't play or isn't really familiar with the process of kind of like, you know, um composing music or isn't familiar with the process of like understanding your scales and so on and so forth. It gives me some intuition in terms of like when things don't sound or feel quite right, but at the end of the day, you're still kind of like, even in those contexts, you're working off of a theory of music or like a theory of what sounds good in music or what music should be. I mean, there's a lot of great art and a lot of great music that doesn't function off of a whole lot of music theory, or isn't going into its artistic process with a lot of intent based consciously on music theory. So, while it can be helpful, it's not like the be in it, it's not the be all end all of like, what is important to operate off of in terms of making a piece of art. With that being said, as I mean, I think it's good information and experience for, someone like me to have, but in terms of like the literal function of like writing my reviews and kind of communicating to the audience, like what about an album is sort of like appealing or stands out or is important in some way, it doesn't really factor all that much. I mean, mostly because like, music theory, chord progressions, melody notes, so on and so forth, talking about, things resolving and are we talking about a three-part harmony, so on and so forth. Like, your average person going into a review is not a musician. So it's like if you're hitting them with all this information, they don't even really care, and the thing is like and also on top of it, just because you're uh, basing your work deeply in all of this stuff, it doesn't mean you're making good music. There's a lot of terrible fucking music that, it's like all the people that are making it are obsessed over is like, oh, is that an F sharp? Oh, I have perfect pitch and da 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 da. And it's like inherently uh working off of or sort of like, basing your whole artistic process and your, musical mindset when you go into creating a piece of music around music theory and music theory alone. And you're not worried about message, you're not worried about concept, you're not worried about aesthetics, you're not worrying about any of that stuff. If all of that stuff comes secondary, don't be surprised if you end up with a soulless piece of crap, you know? Because the thing is like, yeah, that it's true, music is wonderful and beautiful and complex and interesting because, as far as what we understand about it, like there's almost like, a mathematics and there's like a science to it, which I think is maybe it's it's not the only art form to have that to it, but the mathematics and the science of music are specific to music, and it's easy to rabbit hole into that stuff and ignore all the other shit, you know? And look, there are people who focus on the message and the aesthetics and the presentation and the style and the sauce, as it were. And then you go and listen to the music and it's just shit, know? So, and it's just like, repetitive, it's mind numbing, it's uninteresting, melodically or rhythmically, there's nothing really all that much going on. So, I mean, you could find yourself in the opposite position where it's all style and no substance on the music front anyway. So, I think at the end of the day, we should all be trying to sort of attain some kind of balance, in terms of like whether the things we're creating are musically sound in a technical way, but also are they, explore, but also what are they trying to communicate artfully? Um, or, what are they trying to get across aesthetically? Is also, something that I feel like we need to consider.
Well, you were touching there on the maths and science of music, that really rational side. But there's also a very irrational, abstract side to music. Unless there's a plot like in a concept album or lyrics or something like that, it can be really abstract. So, how do you go about avoiding the pitfall in music writing and music reviewing of essentially just reading the track list and then saying a few vague adjectives about each song?
I feel like at the end of the day, like if you're trying to assess any piece of art, whether it's music, whether it's movies, or whether it's anything, you've got to try to speak to what it's evoking out of you emotionally, or what you can sense as a consumer it's trying to evoke out of you. I feel like as a consumer or a viewer or a listener, there's certainly some gut intuitions that you can work off of in order to, come to whatever conclusions based off of context clues that you can gather in terms of like, what is this song trying to make me feel? I don't feel like you need to be necessarily like a music expert to sort of like delineate what Pharrell's Happy is going for. It's like it's not rocket science. But I mean, if you listen to enough music, you can dig into, just about anything and be able to probably correctly and intuitively infer, what exactly when you listen to a band like Death Grips and listen to a song like Hacker, there's a lot of people that don't really have a working knowledge of a lot of like abstract and experimental art and don't really, sort of like understand, socially speaking, kind of like the weird dark underbelly of the information age that inspired a lot of the work on that album. So, you may come across a track like Get Got or again Hacker and just be like, what the fuck are these guys even talking about? Like what are they even on about? And also like to her credit, Taylor Swift on records like Folklore, for example. There was a lot of like um cool backstory stuff and storytelling, elements on certain tracks of that record that you're not going to get if you just are kind of listening to them on the surface or if you're just like listening to any other random pop album. The thing is like I feel like if you're really going to kind of dig beyond the adjective soup, like you said, I feel like, one way to do that is to try to understand emotionally or conceptually or narratively, like where the song is coming from. What is it trying to tell you either through its lyrics or the way musically it feels, or what it's trying to represent or say to you aesthetically. What moods is it trying to evoke? What emotions or experiences is the piece of art trying to represent? I feel like another thing to kind of note on this front um, is like the new More Mother album, for example, which is like a very kind of dark, tortured, harrowing album all about the slave trade, hundreds of years ago, specifically the role that Britain played in ending it, which is often like whitewashed in a lot of respects because, it's often sort of portrayed as this very benevolent thing, and while relatively speaking, it can be seen that way because at that same time you had America just kind of like making the problem worse. But like, Britain's process of going about this wasn't so much, done out of kindness toward those who had been enslaved, but more of like, oh, well, we need to make these guys whole who were the slave owners. I mean, we're kind of ripping them off and tearing them away from their property. So, rather than sort of like do something right by those who had been enslaved up until this point, we're going to worry about the well-being of those who owned the slaves. And all of that storytelling is and all of that historical context is given throughout the album, and the thing is like if you were to sort of like analyze or just talk about that record merely from like, oh, what do the vocal performances sound like, or what are the textures of the instrumentation, or why does this song last that long, or why does this song last long, you're kind of missing a super vital piece of information. And look, I'm not perfect. I'm a human. I don't pick up on every single thing every single time I listen to every album. But if we're talking about reviewing a record and really creating and digging into discourse around an album, and we're not looking just to kind of be like, uh, this song's quixotic, you know, we need to really kind of like discuss what the meanings are behind these tracks and what they're trying to, at least in our own opinion or from our own points of view, what they're communicating to us and what they're telling us and artistically what they represent.
So, apart from just your own taste, is that why you review and tackle a lot of the music that you do, rather than, say, ambient music or a lot of foreign language music? That if you can't speak the language, then you can't speak it.
I think there's quite a bit of ambient music out there that is trying to communicate something. I mean, there's a lot of ambient stuff going on in the vaporwave scene. There are certainly ambient records like Disintegration Loops as well, for an example, that uh, communicate a lot in their concept. One of my albums of the year, which by all means is kind of an ambient record, a drone record, is Tim Hecker's Virgins, which I mean, the front cover literally, evokes the image of, those Iraqi detainees who were tortured. So I mean, look, you could say a lot with instrumental music. You could say a lot with ambient music. Even the new Godspeed album, you could say a lot with instrumental music for sure. Um, it is true that there is like a language barrier with a lot of foreign music that I don't necessarily, have an easy time digging into. And as a result, it can be difficult for me to sort of like, assess some foreign language albums specifically in that way. However, the internet makes it easy to, research that stuff, even if I may not feel it in real time as I'm listening to the album. Um, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like, I feel like if I have a gut feeling, if I have a gut reaction to something, whether it's in a foreign language or not, I'm going that's really more of an incentive for me to review something. It's not so much sort of like the language barrier. A lot of the time, for me personally, it doesn't so much. Um, it doesn't so much prevent me sometimes from of reviewing or understanding, as again, a lot of this stuff can be researched, as much as it sort of makes it difficult sometimes to dig for stuff. I mean, unless you sort of like speak the language, it can be hard to kind of actually dig underneath what is like the most popular music of a certain culture or a certain country. Often, what you end up getting over here in the States when it comes to like music from other places is like what's sort of the most hot or most viral or most discussed or most likely to kind of like, you know, appeal pretty widely from like a popular music perspective. Like for example, like, and I know there is one, there has to be one, it's like, what the hell does like the experimental underground Chinese music scene looks like? Who the fuck even knows? So I mean, most likely the only people over there, the only people who know are the people actually there doing it and are involved, you know. Because of language barriers and probably various government and internet restrictions, like we're not hearing a lot of that stuff. But the thing is, like, we know from like historical context that there's all kinds of crazy and interesting art that is being made even under the most strenuous and uh, outlandish and unique one-of-a-kind circumstances. I mean, look at all of the music, compositions that they found, sort of like notated onto hidden papers when, they went through the homes and affects of people who survived through the Holocaust. It's like you're going through this horrific generational, you know, going to be talked about for hundreds of years, sort of like, a genocidal event. And there's like still people writing and composing music in the midst of all of that. So, I mean, a lot of these places have to have like probably crazy and super interesting music scenes, but we don't hear about them. It's like that stuff is so difficult to um, search through the internet, and it's sort of like, oppressed, or prevented from sort of like getting out there, even within the places they exist in immediately. And artistically, like that's the kind of stuff a lot of the time that I'm interested in. I want to hear music that's like a representation of the human spirit or is like an acknowledgement of the state of the world that we live in. I mean, I like pop. Pop is great. Pop is fun, and I review a lot of pop music positively. Um, some people would even say that I'm a little more forgiving or accepting of it than I need to be. And I think I'm definitely like maybe more pop positive in my old age than I was like a teenager when I just wanted to listen to nothing but edgy shit. Um, but when it comes to like something that really kind of like speaks to your soul in a certain kind of, emotional intensity. I feel like it's the stuff under the surface that's the most interesting. Um, and sometimes, yeah, it can be difficult to dig for that sort of stuff if you're not, familiar with the language.
Do you have any favourites or recommendations from some of these more overlooked corners of the world?
Yeah, I mean, definitely like some, weird underground Japanese noise rock artists and stuff like that. Bands like Melpomene or Ruins, I think are fantastic. But again, even that stuff is like pretty easily accessible if you're an underground rock head. Um, weird European gabber DJs can be pretty fun as well. Soundway Records is an amazing record label in my opinion because they do like almost, I would say like the musical equivalent of um, some real global musical anthropology in a way because they specialize in all of these really cool compilation releases that give you all sorts of obscure musical gems from Thailand or Ghana or Panama and so on and so I own a lot of their compilations. um so I mean, they really do give you like a cool ass sort of snapshot of certain musical scenes and certain musical eras. Another compilation that I absolutely love is this great one called Pomegranates. And I don't know if it's in print anymore, probably not, but you can search it up on YouTube. It's like nothing but like Iranian pop music, like from before the cultural, sort of like revolution and the Shah and everything. So there's all sorts of like every once in a while, like pictures on the internet will go viral and be like, oh, look at Iran, like before, the 1970s and da 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 or whatever. And that's music specifically from that era. So it's like, really crazy ass like groovin pop music. Um, a lot of South Asian and Indian pop music from that same time period is fucking fire as well, like old school Bollywood stuff. There's like an AM Persian radio station from my area that like sometimes plays that stuff, and it's always really cool. Um, but yeah, I think important to be at least like kind of a little worldly with your music listening. And you have to do a little extra sleuthing on the internet to kind of like get there, but I do think it is like, kind of essential.
So, do you think it's a net positive now with the internet that the floodgates to all these scenes are so open?
I think that's a good thing, but I feel like it's almost starting to have like a little bit of an opposite effect in a way because uh the internet I remember was random, it was exciting, it was easier to sort of sift through, and it's becoming less and less of that for several key reasons. One, there's just so much shit on it now that like, there's so much saturation that the amount of stuff that you could be searching for or finding at any given moment, it's like, really difficult to curate it or look through it. Um, and on top of it, the problem that's compounding with that problem is that search engines and searches in general across the internet are getting worse and worse and worse, especially with like when you go on Google and like with most questions or things that you ask, you're just like loaded with AI gunk. You're not even getting an actual person or person's perspective going through any of this to like actually give you genuine information. And sometimes the shit that you're finding is like actually incorrect. And then the next problem compounding on top of those problems that's also making the problem worse is that, especially on platforms like Spotify, the algorithms are continually siloing people into like more and more narrower niches of like, we're just going to give you exactly what you already want. So you're not going to even be presented with the option of venturing out of what you might normally listen to. And those three things kind of compiling, I think is pushing us in a direction where there's less variety, there's less exposure to, I'm not even going to get into ideology and politics, but there's less exposure to music and art that, you know, you wouldn't otherwise stumble upon. Yeah, I'm probably not phrasing that correctly. You're getting exposed to, a lesser variety of music and art than you would have if maybe you were left a little bit more up to your own devices, or if you had like an actual person sort of like driving this stuff in your direction, as opposed to an algorithm that's just like predicting what you're going to like based on like, oh, well, you like Taylor Swift, so you're probably going to like Gracie Abrams, and you're probably going to like, I don't know what, Lizzie McAlpine or something, and we're going to hand you a bunch of other singer-songwriter white girls. And there's nothing wrong with singer-songwriter white girls, but there's an endless string of them, and the internet can just pile so many onto you that you never hear another thing in your life that isn't a singer-songwriter white girl. And, again, that's cool. I like a lot of that stuff. I enjoy it. But if that's all I was listening to, life would be a lot more miserable. And I feel like if the internet should serve any purpose, it's to sort of broaden people's horizons. I mean, yeah, give us that stuff, present us with that stuff, give us some other stuff as well. Um, break us outside of kind of the Western music paradigm, or give us something that's a little more challenging artistically, or is telling us or speaking to a story or experience that maybe we're less adjusted to, or isn't really being kind of showcased all that prominently in the mainstream.
I suppose that's kind of like what you do, balancing the reviews that you know people are going to like and will get views and put food on the table, with ones that you feel really passionate about, maybe about some smaller artists. I know that's not always mutually exclusive, but it sometimes is. And you were talking on a call with the Needle Drop writers about how you make that balance, but do you think you could touch on that a little bit here?
It's mostly just based on sort of like what I kind of can deem as sort of like success. I mean, um, in terms of like the numbers that I'm seeing and the feedback that I'm getting in terms of traffic, and just like my own personal like happiness and mental health, because I know that like, I mean, I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm entirely driven. I'm not 110% driven by, just my own musical or artistic preferences alone. I do want what I do on YouTube to like actually be, measurably speaking, um a successful venture in some form or fashion. You know what I mean? It's like I don't want to just be sitting here and getting like 1,000 views a month. That would be shit. Even if in my own opinion, every review, and shout out to people who are starting that way. I'm not saying like your efforts are for nothing, but I'm saying like if I had a show for it was like, every review I put out, I just got like 1,000 views on it. What the fuck would the point even be? Like I'm trying to like build a platform here. That's kind of like my goal. If at some point I gave up on that goal, I mean, I guess like the amount of views wouldn't really matter. But if I was really just sort of like, and I do love listening to music and I love talking about music, but I would probably give myself a little bit more free time to do other stuff if like I was just kind of doing this casually and didn't really care about the amount of views I was getting. And so, I mean, the amount of views and everything, the amount of engagement that I'm getting does matter. So, I mean, I do, want to see the needle drop be successful. So I try to monitor it on that front as much as I can by talking about the most vital things that I feel like I need to talk about, and just make sure that I'm hitting like a certain amount of views within a year, that I'm seeing, a healthy amount of engagement month to month to month, or, that I'm not missing out on records or conversations that I know everybody is having. But by that same token, that stuff for me personally, like to a certain extent, can get really draining. I feel like if I'm just endlessly ambulance chasing, like, oh, the thing is like, truth be told, I could spend all day on Twitter if I wanted to, if I had really the stomach for it, and just like try to eat up every controversial, stupid, ridiculous, polarizing piece of music discourse that I could find. Instead of worrying about sort of whether or not I want to cover, like, let's say the new Fat Dog record, which was an album I was very excited to review, and an album that virtually nobody asked me to even cover. Instead of worrying about that, I could probably make three videos that views wise would be bangers just by finding like random fucking stupid ass viral tweets where somebody's giving like the worst fucking hot take you've ever heard in your entire fucking life. But the thing is, like, that would be so soul sucking, you know? Like, and all I would be getting out of it at the end of the day is just like views, and it wouldn't really like mean anything, you know? Especially if the conversation happening around it is just like dumb. And look, it's important to like jump into dumb conversations every once in a while, but like there's got to be variety. Um, so I mean, it's really sort of like what I subjectively perceive to be, I guess, like a balance at the end of the day. Like, I just have to sort of like, personally and emotionally through my work because we live in a society where we have to work. We have no choice. But as long as we have to work, I'm going to, through my work, um, try to find ways to uh, fill my cup, as it were, and do it, at least to the degree that I can, like on my own terms. If that means that every once in a while, in order to sort of like keep myself excited about the process of talking about music and reviewing music, review some stuff that I'm just personally really excited about because I just find it interesting, I'm going to do that. Um, because that's the thing, like the consumption part and um, the digging into and through the music part, at least for me, like that's the easiest and most fun bit of the whole process. Like the act of not talking about it or writing something about it, but like really kind of arduously going over the review and just like kind of making sure it's good for other people to see and hear and watch, and um shooting it and then editing it and then going over every single edit and just making sure every single fucking edit and every single fucking video is tight, and that this picture pops up and this lyric comes up and da 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 da. All of that's like the super technical tedious stuff that, like, if I didn't have to do it I wouldn't. But the thing is, like, the fact that I enjoy the art form and I care about the art itself, makes all that stuff worth it. So again, it's really all about sort of like balance and finding a way to kind of like make it work for you, at least from my perspective.
So, even with all the other stuff you have going on, is getting to do the album reviews and diving into those still the best bit?
The best bit is really getting the opportunity to think about the music and kind of like, feel it and like dig into it emotionally. Think about why exactly that is, and maybe not so much writing the review, but sort of like communicating the perspective and then seeing it get reacted to in real time and sort of see what other people think. Like those are kind of really the best parts. And then, also on top of that, like seeing other people get passionate about the music that they love and sort of like, throw you recommendations or sort of like, in response, like come back to you and just be like, oh, I'm actually like really hype about this band. I'd love to see what you think about them. And sometimes like the recommendations are really good. And then I end up talking about that and, working into another video down the road. Those are the, or, people being like, hey, I never would have heard of that band or that album if you hadn't talked about it. Da, da, da. Those are really kind of like the best, aspects of the whole process. I mean, there are downsides, there are parts of it that are like annoying or difficult to deal with, but like all that other stuff kind of makes it worth it and it balances out.
Do you have a sense of maybe responsibility is the wrong word, but a kind of awareness of the influence that you can have on these smaller artists? I mean, it's at a point now where that can be completely career changing for them.
I do, and it's true. Which is why, like, and what even sort of like it categorizes as small these days can be difficult to kind of like, quantify. But when it comes to somebody who's like really just barely starting out, and I know there's, like a lot of uh what's the word I'm trying to use here? I understand why this is the case, but there's a lot of people who when they are starting out, they're not so much worried about making good music, or they're not focused on the craft of making good music, and they're more focused on the craft of breaking through all the noise. And um and again, I get it because honestly, even if you are making good music, that's no fucking guarantee that you're going to break through the noise. And there are tons and really like, dozens of artists every year who seemingly find ways to do that, but their music sucks, you know? So I mean, I understand why there is sort of like a focus on that. Because a lot of people are focused on or are wanting to make it in order to sort of like make money and make their lives easier. And again, I don't fault people for going into music with that motivation sometimes, because we economically and socially we live in a fucking capitalist hellscape. So, I don't sort of blame people for like wanting to sort of like, look at music in some form or fashion as like this is a way to make a buck. I mean, for a lot of people, it's marketed that way, like the fame and the access and the this and that you get from sort of being at a certain level of popularity. Like that's all you hear about from some artists who have kind of like made it. Um, so I don't blame people for necessarily seeing music in that light. Um, and if we actually lived in a society where we supported artists, not only with like the industry working to their benefit, but I don't know, supported them through housing or some kind of government benefit or something, if they achieved a certain, I don't know, status or whatever, artists could focus on art instead of worrying about like, oh, is this my next hit? I mean, even if you had that program, people would still want to make hits, but maybe they could actually sort of like sit there and really sort of like conceive of something or work on something with like a lot of intent, and maybe the amount of time it may need to really kind of like turn into the best version of itself, instead of like everybody just trying to make like algorithm slop.
Just from what you were saying there, what do you think about the relatively new discourse of consumption? I mean, you even said it yourself. That word, consume, is a newer way of talking about art rather than experienced, felt, lived in, stuff like that.
Everything, unfortunately, is content now. Everything is content. My videos are content, and that's always been the case. And, I mean, I sort of get why they're seen that way, but like my videos are content, music is content, films are content. It's all content. Like, and that's not to say like, um, that's not to say that it's actually lost its meaning. I feel like it's all still art, and there's a lot of great art still being made today. It's just that the pathways through which people consume these things and see them and experience them, like you say, they're all treated in the same way. And it's also sort of like transactional and unceremonious, and all continues to occur in this like greater web of cultural saturation, that it's that no one thing is sort of emphasized over any other thing. And as a result, I feel like it all kind of like blends together into this like meaningless web of noise, um, where it's difficult to, um, as an artist in any medium, to make a dent in the cultural discourse, to where the thing that you're communicating or saying actually like resonates, and it's a thing that you're saying that has some kind of emotional depth to it. That's what makes like an artist, and not to sort of like get into some kind of like glazing process here, but that's like what makes an artist like Kendrick Lamar so significant. You're like, whoa, this guy's actually speaking to some really crazy, complex, emotional or personal issues, and yet like he has this incredibly huge mainstream status. Like how the it's a, I mean, it would be less impressive or less of a discussion point if there were like five or six or seven other guys out there doing exactly what he did at his level of popularity. Like the closest point of comparison is J. Cole, and J. Cole's not fucking writing Auntie Diaries, you know? Like he's literally had transphobic bars, and the thing is like, it's not like there's four or five or six pop artists out there, and it's not even a genre thing because it's not like there's five or six pop artists or rock artists who are at that same level of Kendrick Lamar popularity who are speaking to the same things that he is. We're talking about like almost a singular guy in the mainstream, who's communicating what he's communicating through his music. Um, so I mean, again, not to focus on him, it's more of a statement of the lack of this kind of messaging and the lack of this kind of emotional depth and the lack of this kind of communication broadly across like mainstream music. Um, and again, the reason I think for that is that there's not a whole lot of time to sort of like go over and process and really dissect pieces of art that are longer or more difficult or are maybe challenging the audience more or asking more from them. So as a result, what ends up kind of like making it in terms of popularity and success and streams and algorithmic boost is stuff that just sort of, for the most part, like elicits the fastest reaction. And that'll be anything that can be consumed quickly, or speaks to some kind of like super baseline, lowest common denominator feeling or perspective, that the largest possible amount of people at the same time can hold. Like, oh, I want to be successful, or oh, I'm in love, or oh, I'm horny, or oh, you know, I'm feeling restless and I just want to dance or something. And there's nothing wrong with making music about that stuff. Like some of the best music of all time has been made about that stuff. But I'm just saying that that's sort of like what you're left with for the most part, because the pipelines through which we're consuming this stuff, and there's so much stuff coming down the pipe that all we can really do societally is try to process or go through all of it as quickly as we can. And the stuff that, sort of challenges you a bit more, or asks for more from you, it's kind of hard to, see that stuff get the same amount of attention or, boost or popularity, because there's so much drowning it out. There's so much drowning it out.
The last thing I really wanted to ask you about was the new website. I suppose for a lot of people, it kind of seemed to appear out of nowhere, like just the Needle Drop does news now. What was the impetus for starting it, and where do you see it going over the next few years?
Yeah, it was just Lamb Goat approaching me, with the idea, and it was something that we sort of like I really kind of thought over for a period of months, and but I have been wanting to, just find ways, and this is, it's a difficult process because obviously I have to do all of this while simultaneously just doing my usual job. It's like through the midst of all of these changes, like I'm still doing my reviews, I'm still doing my streams, I'm still doing um, you know, my Fantano channel content and so on and so forth. So it's taken a little bit to get to this point because it's only been in the times when I'm not sort of in the midst of all of that I've been able to like really think about this and consider it and sort of like think about where it should be or could be moving. And I'm just like trying to take the process step by step and slowly, by starting out with, basically inviting in writers and kind of building a base of people contributing to just like a very straightforward news section where we're covering just kind of like the stories of the week on a regular basis and just like kind of see where that goes. And then as things like become kind of steady and we gain more momentum and sort of more of a regularity as we move into 2025, the hope is to for the website to try to just like build a little bit more of an editorial voice and bring in people who are going to kind of help and contribute to this idea of like while there is a lot of music out there, like I've been saying, and it's difficult to, kind of like work through the noise and make sense of all of it. I feel like, kind of the future when it comes to music discussion and music discourse, if there is going to be a continued demand for what I do or something along the lines of what I do, it's going to be in curation. It's going to be in the ability or, the specialty of kind of finding a way to work through all the shit and explain it and, you know, give people a way who are all kind of like inundated with all this stuff of kind of like finding something in the chaos that means something to them or is special to them in some kind of way. I'm looking for people who are trying to, find their own way through the art of taste making and like actually pick through the noise and be like, oh, here's the, it's like I'm looking through the fucking matrix code and it's like, oh, here's actually the special thing that actually stands out in some sort of way. And I can communicate and speak to what about it makes it special or what makes it stand out and actually communicate that to other people and get them to sense the same thing in it, by either just straight up presenting it to them or, getting them to understand what exactly about it makes it special so that they don't necessarily maybe need to do all the work, in order to sort of come to a realization about it. You can sort of like help contribute to an experience of making that realization happen faster. Because again, I feel like the difficulty a lot of people have with kind of going outside of their usual music taste when they're sifting through stuff to listen to is that they just want to hear or they're most easily able to grasp onto things that feel familiar to them you know we want to try to find ways to present them with stuff that is new to them or novel in some way in order to not only broaden people's tastes and music perspectives but like also like just make sure that the world of music doesn't become uh one note and homogenized because I feel like if the algorithms are doing or anything or contributing to any kind of phenomenon, it's it's that it's easy to sort of create a situation in people's heads where they're only being sort of like exposed to one kind of sound or one kind of vibe or one kind of trend over and over and over and over. Because the internet will feed you that one thing that you're into endlessly if you want it to, or if you're not finding ways to kind of like break out of that cycle. And some people kind of get herded into that slaughterhouse without even sort of like understanding that that's what they're being led into. And I feel like we as tastemakers and music fans should be finding ways to kind of like help people broaden their, again, their horizons and break them out of those kind of like cycles and just put them onto some other stuff.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me, and it's been really nice to have you on.
No problem, Albert.